Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Osborne, and I'm coming to you live from Michigan State University, along with my EAB University colleagues, Amy Stone from the Ohio State University and Adam Whitty from Purdue. We welcome you today to this presentation on practical woodlot management before, during, and after EAB by Lenny Farley at Purdue University. Lenny is an extension forester with the Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center in Purdue's Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. He graduated with a BS in Forest and Wildlife Management in 1985 and a master's in silviculture in 1991, both from Purdue. During his career, he has been a nursery forester in charge of field operations, a district forester for the Indiana Division of Forestry, serving landowners in a 10-county area, and then he joined the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources as an extension forester for the Hardwood Tree Improvement and Regeneration Center in 2007. Lenny provides programs and publications in a variety of media directed toward improving the regeneration and sustainable management of high-quality hardwood trees and forests in the central hardwood region. Before we get started with this presentation of Emerald Ash Borer University, I want to remind you that your comments and questions are welcome today. Please feel free to write them in the chat pod on the left of your screen. We will make a note of them, and Lenny will be able to respond to those questions after his presentation to help keep the flow of the webinar smooth. Your feedback is also very important for us to keep these free webinars coming, so please stay tuned until the end when we will be providing a link to a survey that we hope you'll take time to fill out. For those of you needing CEUs, your survey information is necessary for us to process them. We will be sending out an EAB goodie bag to the first 10 people who fill out the survey. But even if you've received one of these goodie bags in the past, we hope that you will be giving us your feedback on this webinar as well. This webinar and all Emerald Ash Borer University webinars is being recorded and will be available for viewing in the next couple of days at www.emeraldashborer.info. And you will also find the recordings for all previous EAB University webinars there. Thank you for attending today, and with that I'm going to bring up Lenny's presentation and we will get started. All right, welcome Lenny.
Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Is everybody picking up on me all right? All right, great. Well, let's begin. What I hope to do today is provide some very general recommendations on woodlot management in relation to EAB. And we're going to be looking at a timeline of before, during, and after, but some of these recommendations really cut across the whole span of the infestation cycle that we may be looking at depending on where you're at. I want to emphasize these recommendations are going to be very general because each woodlot represents a very different situation, both in terms of the biology, the tree mix, the local context in terms of management and markets, and also the landowner's management objectives. So we'll keep that in mind as we go along here. I do want to mention the importance of management objectives. They really, to a great extent, decide what kind of management is going to be happening on properties in conjunction with the consideration of the current biological conditions, and then also what kind of objectives we want to see achieved in the future. And most landowners have a mix of objectives in many cases. What we see in terms of interest oftentimes is a strong interest in wildlife habitat, whether it be hunting or viewing opportunities. Many people are looking at recreational use of their woodland properties in many different contexts for many different types of recreational pursuits. Not a small number of people, at least sometime in the ownership of their properties, will be looking at an opportunity to get timber income to help offset some of the costs of owning and maintaining a property. And then for not a small number of people, there's just a natural interest in the landscape and biodiversity that's present in forest environments. And for many folks, these land ownerships represent a family legacy they want to pass on to the next generation in better condition than they received it. So all those things are going to inform how we look at management and what kind of decisions we make. What I always encourage people to do is as they look at management of their forest properties, seek some professional assistance in that process. There's a lot of things that go into this, both in terms of biology, local markets and conditions, situations like emerald ash borer that may be something landowners don't suspect is going to happen, but it's going to have a huge impact on their forest environments in the future. And so it's a good idea to get that perspective of professional assistance and advice. I always consider forestry kind of a profession of local expertise, and so it's important to have those folks helping you on the ground that have a good knowledge of what's happening both biologically and also socially and economically in the area. Landowners can get in contact with professional resource managers and foresters by contacting their local extension agent, the USDA Department of Agriculture offices in their counties, or Soil and Water Conservation District offices, and can typically get a good referral at those offices of someone that can help them out. So if you plan on managing your woodlot either for healthy and vigorous forest conditions or for timber products and income, you do need to develop a working relationship with a professional forester to get the best advice and assistance as you go forward with your management plans. Several forestry types that can help you. Many states have state forestry agencies that provide private landowner assistance. That's what I did for 15 years here in Indiana, working with private landowners. That's a really good starting point. Oftentimes those services are free. Because they are free, you may have to wait a while to get access to those services, but they provide great advice and assistance in terms of getting folks started with management and a recognition of the resources on their property. If you have some actual management needs and you're not capable of doing that yourself, there's a variety of foresters that can help you on the ground. Private consulting foresters are available to help as contractors for landowners to do a variety of practices. This could be plan management and writing, timber harvests, timber stand improvement practices, invasive species control, tree plantings. Many of those services are available from private consulting foresters. We also have a set in many states of industry foresters that work for the wood products and wood utilization industries in the state. And many of these folks are available either for hire or sometimes in some cases free services in consideration for timber harvesting rights on properties. And so they can offer some valuable services to landowners as well. And then in many cases we have either non-governmental or government agency conservation organization foresters available. So some Soil and Water Conservation District offices or some conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy or others may have foresters on staff that can help some landowners with some management aspects of their property. And then of course in most of our states we have extension foresters associated with the land-grant universities that can provide education, assistance, training, and a variety of resources. And so contact those folks as well for information on forest management in your area. So let's get into some of the management recommendations I have. And you'll see some commonalities as we go through here. I'm going to be hitting on some themes pretty strongly that I think are very important when we consider management in these forest environments in relation to the emerald ash borer. One of the first things I think we need to look at is recognizing that the impact of emerald ash borer in many cases is going to be a forest disturbance. We're going to have a fair amount of tree mortality if we have a high percentage of ash. And tree disturbance has a tendency to provide opportunities for invasive plant species to invade or become more common in forest environments. Many of these species are set up with shade tolerance, casting large number of seed, rapid growth rate, long growing seasons that provide them a competitive advantage over native species, both in terms of growing in the shade of forests and then also when we have a forest disturbance that creates sunlight environments in the forest floor can respond much more rapidly than our native species. So it's always a good idea to, number one, scout your forest areas for these invasive species, and then when you find them, control them as quickly as you can. They're going to respond very aggressively to the additional light that's provided when ash is killed by emerald ash borer. And so control these invasive species beforehand can be very important in terms of keeping a handle on those infestations. A good resource for identifying invasive species that may be invading your property and also control recommendations is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network website, and that's mipn.org. And you can of course also contact your local forestry agencies for information on identification and control recommendations. In the pictures here we've got both on the left hand side a tree of heaven seedling that could respond very quickly to sunlight provided by the death of an ash tree in the overstory. And then on the right-hand side, a heavy infestation of mature Asian bush honeysuckle that would essentially, as light was provided with the death of ash in this overstory, would prevent any desirable regeneration from happening in the understory if those plants aren't controlled. It's also a good idea to get a feel for what the actual constituency of ash is in your property. And so it's a good idea to have an inspection done by a forester to get a feel for either through a full inventory or inventory process on the property, or a walkthrough evaluation of how much ash is actually present. That's going to inform what kind of management practices we might want to get involved in terms of salvaging wood material, replanting to occupy sites that are going to be vacated as the ash dies, or controlling invasive species in particular sites. So what's the amount of ash that's actually present on the property? What percentage of the forest cover does it represent? Another important aspect is how is it distributed on the property? If ash is maybe only 10 or 15% of the forest itself and distributed relatively easily or evenly across the property, the death of ash might actually represent a natural thinning that's not going to have a huge impact on forest regeneration and characteristics. But if the ash is heavily concentrated in certain areas, when the ash dies, we may have large openings or other situations that may have significant considerations for regenerating the forest area and what quality and type of regeneration we get back in those areas. We also want to look at, if we have an interest in recouping some of the value in those trees, how much marketable wood volume is actually present, and is it in a position and are there markets where it could be harvested. And these are important considerations in terms of future management and also obtaining some value out of those trees as they die or before they die. The other thing we want to evaluate is what species are already present that may fill in the gaps left by dying ash. In many cases, trees and shrubs that are already growing on the forest floor, what foresters call advanced regeneration, has a competitive advantage over other things that might come up from seed as these ash trees die. And so an evaluation of what's in the forest floor already may help us have a better understanding of what kind of regeneration we can expect once that ash starts to die and create canopy gaps. The other thing we want to look at is there potential for damage to other property resources once these ash start dying. And so a significant ash death near streams is going to prevent a possible risk of erosion along those areas. Are we going to have a significant amount of ash that may cause damage to structures or block trails as it falls? Or are we going to lose significant benefits in terms of shade trees in locations maybe where we have recreational facilities or possibly shelter belts and windbreaks? So all these would be things we would evaluate with an inventory of the property before emerald ash borer actually arrived on site. If you're concerned about what species of trees may be regenerating on your property before emerald ash borer gets there, one thing we can do in some cases is do underplanting of desirable tree species in areas where we're going to have a significant amount of ash die. Some of the species that respond very well to this in some locations are some of the oak species. They can actually tolerate a fair amount of shade relatively early in their lifetime, but not for long periods. And so if we anticipate we're going to have ash mortality in the next 3, 4, 5 years or so, it might be a good idea to underplant some oaks in some of those locations that are going to respond once the ash trees die and provide additional sunlight. However, every woodland situation is different, and so this is a decision that you would want to make in conjunction with your forester to help you pick the right species, the correct sites, and also the best methods to have the best success at these particular practices. If you're thinking about possibly selling some of the ash timber, it is a good idea to consider doing this before emerald ash borer arrives in your woodlot. And there's several reasons for this. The most valuable ash typically are trees that have very light colored sapwood. And what we're finding, especially with some of the work our wood products professor Dan Cassens here at Purdue is doing on his property and in other locations and working with industry, is that once emerald ash borer starts infesting trees, particularly once half the crown is dead or more, we can start seeing significant staining of that sapwood, and that's going to significantly impact the potential value of that wood to the industry. And so what he's found, cutting trees both on his property and milling them with a band sawmill, and also working with some of the folks in the industry, is that once about half of the tree is defoliated, that white sapwood starts to stain. And so his assessment is foresters and industry have essentially made the correct recommendation to landowners from the very start, and that is to salvage trees while the trees are still alive to retain the best value. There's still potentially value in the wood once the trees are mostly defoliated or dead, but that value typically is much lower because the quality of the wood is deteriorated, and we're typically looking at very much low-grade markets like pallets and crating. I'm going to show you some examples of what we're talking about here with this white sapwood versus dark heartwood and ash. In the upper photo, we have 5 ash logs, and then in the very center we've actually got a shagbark hickory log that's slipped in, so don't pay attention necessarily to the wood color on that one. But the 2 top logs, let me get my pointer here, and here, are demonstrating what would potentially be pretty high quality ash wood here. We've got very light colored white sapwood that's going to saw out into pretty nice quality boards. If we look at the wood color on these bottom logs, we can see it's much darker, and in relation to that, the wood quality is also going to be lower and typically derive a much lower price when we look at selling it. Still saleable, but not nearly as economically beneficial as the white wood. Here's a panel showing cut boards from ash. We can see the pretty white wood on the sapwood, and then the dark staining in the darker heartwood, and some of the reasoning behind that value difference that we see between those 2 characteristics in the wood. And additionally, some freshly sawn boards showing some of the staining that we see in the dark heartwood, and also on the right hand side even staining in some of the sapwood that's related to emerald ash borer mortality and the degradation of the wood that happens as that process proceeds. So typically a good idea, if you're thinking about capturing some of the value in your ash, to look at marketing before the emerald ash borer actually arrives and starts doing significant damage. We have several considerations when we start thinking about marketing any kind of tree, including ash. The first thing is, when landowners look to sell timber, it's always a good idea to get professional forester assistance with marking and marketing trees. The selection of trees to take is an important consideration in terms of what trees are going to regenerate in the future and the value of those trees, and also setting up a good logging situation and good contracts that are going to protect the landowner in the logging process. And then getting the trees into the marketplace to take advantage of the competitive uses that may exist between different markets can oftentimes get landowners a better price for the timber. So all those aspects are very important, and services that many professional foresters can provide to those landowners. It's also oftentimes a good idea, especially in smaller woodlots, to not just look at the ash when we're thinking about marketing situations with emerald ash borer threatening. There may be other trees that, due to damage, disease issues, overcrowding, or overmaturity, may be ready to harvest. And there may also be some high quality trees that it just makes sense to harvest at that time too, if landowners are interested in that as an objective on their property. And so don't just tune in on the ash, but also think about how can we actually improve the woods as we do this harvest. One of the other considerations we have, and this is an important one to think about, is we don't necessarily want to try to harvest each and every ash on the property. We found that in some locations, ash has survived the initial emerald ash borer attack. And there's thoughts, and some of the studies are starting to look more strongly at this, is there may be some natural resistance in these trees to the emerald ash borer. And so we want to be able to find those trees on the landscape. So retaining some of those ash to provide an opportunity to find more of these trees gives us a chance to perhaps capture the genetics that are locked up in those. So landowners can maybe look at harvesting high quality, high value ash trees, but perhaps trees that are lower quality, trees that are smaller in size and aren't going to represent as much value or aren't going to be as attractive to the marketplaces. And also trees that are in difficult situations for harvesting that may create damage to the property. Those trees could be left behind, and those represent a reservoir that we can look at to see if we actually have some resistance available, ash that actually survives the emerald ash borer attack. If you're looking for additional information on best practices for selling timber, you can talk to your state forestry agency, extension foresters in your area, or this particular website, Call Before You Cut, provides information to landowners on best harvesting practices for private properties. A consideration anytime we start looking at utilizing and potentially moving ash is making sure we understand the quarantines in the areas we're operating and we obey those quarantine conditions. And so it's important to check and see what are the legal situations that I'm dealing with in terms of utilizing and moving ash around the landscape, and make sure I'm obeying all those quarantine conditions. And if we have opportunities to get permits or inspections to move material, that I'm actually doing that to make sure I'm not moving emerald ash borer around unnecessarily in the materials that I'm harvesting. And in general, we say don't move firewood because of all the other situations that are associated with the movement of firewood in terms of insects and diseases. If you want to find information on the quarantine issues in your particular area, you can visit the emeraldashborer.info site and check your state for quarantine information. Let's move that to during the emerald ash borer infestation. We do have still some opportunities to salvage harvest dying ash, particularly if we've got into the early stages of the infestation where we don't have much tree mortality yet. Tree tops are starting to decline, but we've not seen a lot of death. And so, as we mentioned earlier, cutting trees before more than half of the crown is dead is generally going to result in better wood quality and also safer harvesting operations as compared to later in the infestation. And so what we see is, as more and more of that top dies, in the process of harvesting trees, we can shake those dead limbs out. And those historically have been called widow makers for good reason. Any limb, almost no matter the size, falling from 50 or 60 feet up can be deadly. And so it's always a good idea to be concentrating our harvest on material that's primarily live, that has solid crowns. When we get into those partially dead and fully dead crown situations, it's much more dangerous to harvest timber. The other thing we want to think about is safety and operations on the property and protecting infrastructure. And so during the emerald ash borer infestations, identify and in most cases drop trees that threaten structures, that may block trails, could destroy fences, or damage other types of infrastructure on your property. We also want to think about dropping trees in high recreational traffic use areas that could represent a threat to people that spend a lot of time there. And the reason I recommend dropping these before the emerald ash borer infestation is completely done is that, once again, waiting to drop trees after they're dead makes felling much more dangerous and just raises our risks a great deal more. Anytime we're operating in an emerald ash borer infestation area and we've got tops dying, we need to be very careful about accessing and operating in those areas. As those limbs gradually die, the wood starts drying out, it starts decaying. It's much more easy for those limbs to drop, especially in points where we've got high winds, heavy snow or ice events, but really those limbs could drop at any time. So great care needs to be taken when we're working in some of those areas where we're already seeing some crown mortality or total tree mortality. You're going to see I'm back on this theme again. The invasive species are going to be very opportunistic in trying to take advantage of the spaces that are created when emerald ash borer kills ash. So it's an important thing to monitor properties for invasion of invasive species that want to occupy that space that's being vacated by the dying ash. The other thing we can do is identify areas where we may need to do a little bit of additional management to make sure we get good natural regeneration of trees, or where we maybe want to plant trees to replace the ash as it dies. And if you notice this photo, on the right hand side we have some very green material. That is Asian bush honeysuckle. And the spring and fall is a great time to kind of inspect your woodlands for invasive species, because oftentimes they stay green and growing longer than any of our native species, and so they kind of pop up like Easter eggs out there on the landscape. You'll also notice that I've got some plastic mesh in this photo, maybe a little bit hard to see, but one of the things we see is that in many cases our deer populations are very high and actually present a significant barrier to good tree regeneration. And so depending on the situation in your area, it may be worthwhile to put up either some temporary electric fence or temporary mesh fence to prevent deer from accessing areas that you want to actively regenerate to tree species. Another consideration is if you've recently had a tree planting and for whatever reason ash was included in that. I think most of the tree plantings done in the last 10 years, we've really excluded ash from those plantings knowing what was coming down the road. But if you do have that situation, or if you've got a natural regenerating area with young seedlings, typically 4 or 5 years old or less, we want to evaluate what the death of ash is going to do in those locations. And so if we're seeing a significant amount of ash dying in some of those plantings, from what I've heard, EAB can infest ash that's thumb size or larger, so it's very possible that 3 or 4 year plantings could have ash already dying in them. If we've got large patches that are being opened up, that can have an impact on the quality of the trees that are neighbors to those ash. So it may pay to come in and plant things like black cherry, tulip tree, or even river birch and sweet gum that are very fast growers that can hopefully keep up with the trees already on site. The advantage of doing this is it fills in those empty spaces in the plantings, provides for the side shading that's important for good tree form, and also helps keep competition from weeds and invasive species down in those plantings through the shading. Now let's get to after emerald ash borer. If you do plan to salvage trees after emerald ash borer has gone through and killed trees, either for timber or firewood, you need to use extreme caution. And in fact, I typically recommend against it unless you've got professional experience in taking down dead trees. The problem is that all these branches in the top now are dead, decaying, drying out. They're very easily shaken out of the tops in the process of felling, either as the tree itself starts to break down or as it hits other trees in the process of coming down. And so we've created a very dangerous felling situation here. So typically you want to work primarily in partially alive or live trees when you're felling. The other thing that happens is that wood decays on the lower part of the tree and dries out. The hinge that you create when you cut a tree down helps you control where it's going. As that wood becomes drier and more decayed, that hinge may not hold and you could lose control of where that tree actually falls. So we've just got a much more dangerous and delicate situation when we're working with dead wood. So care and expertise is needed in those situations for salvage. Recognize that if we've not been paying attention to invasive species and they're becoming established in the holes created by the death of ash, that's going to create a potential problem in the future, especially with all the sunlight. These plants can grow very quickly and may be setting seed 3 or 4 years after their establishment in some cases. And in the case of many of them, and here's autumn olive with a very heavy seed crop, once those seed are set, the potential for a rapid spread of invasive species across your property is in place. And so it's a good idea to continue to evaluate your property for invasive plant species, actively control them, and particularly prevent them from casting seed, which can lead to great population expansion very quickly. Now, one of the things that emerald ash borer may end up doing in many woodlots is creating openings, especially where we've got clusters of ash that have grown together that have all died. And these actually provide regeneration opportunities for light-loving tree species. And in many cases, that can actually be a positive in some woodland situations, because in a lot of places, especially here in the Midwest, many of our woodlands are actually aging. A lot of them are 60, 70, 80 years plus in age. They have solid canopies, and the light-loving species are gradually disappearing in the understories of those woodlots because of all that shade. And so these openings present an opportunity to regenerate species like black cherry, tulip tree, the oaks, black walnut, and a variety of other very desirable species, both for wildlife and also timber impacts or income potential. But oftentimes we have other species that are less desirable in some situations that come in. And so as competition for some of those species, we may have what the picture demonstrates here. We've got primarily tulip tree that's regenerated in this opening, but right in the center of the opening, that very stout stem, is tree of heaven, an invasive tree species. And so we need to monitor these areas for both weed tree species and also potentially the growth of vines that respond to that great sunlight that could overwhelm our desirable tree regeneration. And so some management is typically called for in these situations to do some thinning and weeding to provide the best growth conditions for our desirable trees. We mentioned earlier this rare situations where we do have some ash that survive the initial infestation and wave of death that happens in ash after EAB has gone through an area. And it's a good idea for you to go out on your property after emerald ash borer has gone through and killed all the ash that you're aware of and see if actually any have survived. This would potentially provide an opportunity for one more tree to study that may actually be presenting some potential for resistance to the emerald ash borer. And there are researchers that are very interested in looking at these trees across the landscape. So as you look across your property after emerald ash borer has actually occurred and had a big mortality event with the ash, and you find ash that are in good condition, especially if they were next to ash trees that were killed by emerald ash borer, contact your state forestry agency or extension forestry specialists at your local land-grant universities to let them know about that. And they may be able to notify the scientists who are interested in researching these trees, and they may actually provide some genetic material that we could be using in future studies to see if we can reintroduce ash in some of these areas that actually have resistance. So I'm going to summarize some of my recommendations now and be happy to take any questions that you may have on some of the management recommendations we've made. One of the things that we find in woodlots is because of the diversity of tree species we have, because of the seed that is brought in by wind, water, wildlife, that as spaces are created, trees have a tendency to naturally regenerate in many of these places. Now, deer can actually present a barrier to this if they're at very high numbers by browsing off that regeneration. But in the absence of very high deer numbers, we're going to get tree regeneration happening in most woodlots once emerald ash borer has killed ash. The question is, what species, what density, and are those species desirable in relation to the objectives you have for the property? And so in conjunction with recommendations from your forester, once that regeneration starts happening, you want to maybe think about doing some weeding and thinning in some locations to favor the species that best meet your objectives. So an example would be if you've got a strong wildlife management objective and you have several species regenerating in places where ash has been left or has been killed by emerald ash borer. We want to look at what species of trees are going to best encourage the wildlife that you're interested in on your property. So we're thinking about food producers like oaks and hickories and walnut. We may also be thinking about cover, and so some of the native shrubs like our native dogwoods and viburnums may be very, very desirable. And once again, working against the invasive species that typically aren't a benefit for very many purposes we have for our properties. And so, as we mentioned, be vigilant about invasive species, recognizing that space provided as ash dies is going to be one of the things that gives invasive species an opportunity to either enter your property from neighboring seed sources or to get a better foothold in your property and become much more difficult to manage in the future. One of the other benefits that we actually get from some death of trees and forests is that trees growing near those trees that die typically get a release from the competition that happens in the crown space. And so looking across your property, you may actually find some areas where the death of ash has created a thin situation where the trees are actually going to perform better, and you may get some more of the benefits that you want out of that situation. So we don't want to see ash die, but there may be some situations where the death of some trees in your forest actually provides a natural thinning that can benefit overall forest health. So I think one of the main things I'm encouraging is to think about actively managing both before, during, and after emerald ash borer infestations. And this provides us opportunities and advantages in a variety of ways. Number one, if we're thinking about the fact that we are going to lose ash, and what's the distribution of ash? Is it patchy? Or are there large areas where we're going to have almost nothing there because all the ash is going to die? We may have an opportunity to manage and improve regeneration of desirable trees and shrubs, either through the thinning and weeding or potentially even planting of desirable species in those situations. If we know that emerald ash borer is coming and we can plan ahead, we've got an opportunity to capture value in some of the wood involved in those trees and think about harvesting opportunities. We also recognize that this problem can create issues in terms of the invasion of invasive plant species, and we need to be vigilant in taking active measures to prevent those species from becoming established on our properties. And we also want to do an evaluation and the management we can to reduce risks of damage to property values or people as we look at these issues coming forward in relation to emerald ash borer infestation and ash death. And so in all these things, what I recommend you do is work closely with your forester to get the best management advice and assistance based on your objectives for the property and the conditions you're facing in your area. And that's going to help you actually come through the emerald ash borer infestation and ash death with hopefully a forest that's in better condition, as opposed to a situation where we're really not deeply involved in the management and kind of letting things happen as they do. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to give these very basic and general recommendations. I'd be happy to try to deal with any questions we've got now.
Lenny. I see that Cliff wants to know about should he be keeping blue ash since they are resistant to emerald ash borer.
I think that's not a bad idea, Cliff. I've heard various responses in terms of how well blue ash is held up in some areas versus others, but there does seem to be some evidence that at least in some locations it's hanging in there. And so I think it's not a bad decision to keep blue ash. I will say that unfortunately blue ash is probably one of our lowest timber value species ashes. The wood quality typically is not very good. So if you've got a really strong timber management, timber income objective, blue ash is not one of the best choices for wood quality. But it is an ash. It's going to provide some of the ecological benefits of ash, and so I think in places where we have it, it's not a bad idea to retain as much as we can.
Anyone else have questions or comments? Please feel free to put them in the chat pod at this time. Lenny, this has been really good, solid recommendations for woodlot management, and it's been really clear and concise. Even someone like me who's not really that well versed in woodlot management, this sounds perfectly easy to understand and follow. So I hope the participants let your colleagues and anyone else who's interested or concerned about EAB and their woodlots, let them know about this webinar and urge them to check out the recorded webinar that's going to be on the www.emeraldashborer.info website either later today or early part of tomorrow. So I think that Lenny, I think I'm going to put your contact information, i.e. your email address, on the website too, in case folks need to want to have questions and want to get a hold of you.
That would be perfect. I didn't include it in my program and should have, so thanks for doing that.
Information about the survey, and I hope everyone will kind of decide to fill it out for us. We've got the URL right there. All you have to do is click on that and fill it out, and you will be doing us a great service. All right, I'm going to leave this up for a few more minutes. And then I'm going to close the meeting. But again, Lenny, thank you so much for joining us and putting together this presentation and talking to us about this, because we get a lot of questions. And I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people looking at the recorded webinars. Days like this, a lot of times you've got folks outside and they're not able to watch these during the day, but we always get great responses on our recorded webinars. So the last time I checked over all the webinars, we've had 3,500 folks, over 3,500 folks on the live meetings, but then we've had over 35,000 who've attended gone in and looked at the recorded webinar. So it's always you know, yeah, it's nice to know that folks are looking at these things and getting some good information.
That's great.
So thank you. All right.
Well, I was really happy to participate.
I think I'm going to close the meeting. I'm going to close it at 11:42. So everyone, if you could give us your survey information, questions, comments on those surveys, we'd be glad to answer any questions, and also we appreciate any feedback you can give us.